The last time I filmed a video, I was recovering from a cold, and just after that, I caught the flu, which I am currently recovering from, which is not fun. So basically, this year, so far, I've learned that I have the immune system of a small Victorian child. But aside from my 2026 learnings, I actually need to look back on the previous month in 2025 because we need to do a wrap up video for December. So buckle up as I say about the 6 books that I read last month, including what they're about, what I liked about them, what I disliked about them, and why I rated them out of 5 stars. And if you're new here, hi, welcome. I'm Katerina. I don't usually sound this ill, but if you've caught me in the last 2 videos, then I am sorry. But I make videos about all things books, and if that's your thing, why not subscribe? So kicking off, the very first month I read in December was Cold Kitchen by Caroline Eden. This is essentially a food and travel memoir where the author recounts her personal trips as she travels through Eastern Europe, Africa, as well as Central and South Asia. And she reflects on specific dishes from each region whilst also exploring the history and politics to showcase how food acts as a bridge between cultures and people. And I rated this book 3 stars, which I think is a pretty solid rating for my first ever food/travel memoir, because I haven't read a book like this before, so this was very much a new experience for me. I went into this thinking it was going to be more in the style of a cookbook, but I was actually pleasantly surprised when I saw that it had writing that was more similar to a memoir. And it was also really heartfelt at times because the author travels to some quite difficult places, both historically and politically, such as cities that are currently experiencing war, and taking the time to explain the history and the politics of certain areas and how that subsequently impacted the culture and the food and the people there, which I think is something really important because food is such an integral part of our lives, not only to stay alive, but socially as well. And by linking up all these different aspects, I found the narrative to be actually quite engaging. And also, if you do end up liking the dishes that she's talking about, she also includes recipes at the end of each chapter, so you can also make it yourself. However, I didn't rate this 5 stars because there were a lot of discussions about other topics that I didn't really feel that were that relevant. For example, I mentioned there's a lot of talk about history and politics, but there was a lot of discussion about war, to the point where I really think this book should have been titled The Cold War Kitchen. For me personally, there were just too many mentions about the Ukrainian war, and that's coming from someone who is actually part Ukrainian. All the mentions felt very superficial, they didn't really have much substance to them because every time she mentioned it, she was just like, Putin is a bad guy, and I'm a good person for repetitively mentioning in every chapter how I'm against this war. Like, yeah, 1 or 2 mentions of it is fine, but to repeatedly mention it in every chapter honestly kind of took me out of the book. I'm here to read about food and travel, not to be constantly reminded that some of my family are experiencing a war. I also read from various people that there were many factual inaccuracies throughout the book, which, let's be real, isn't great. I think if you're writing a book, you should always triple check your facts from various different sources. And also for me, I guess this book just didn't really have like an overall sense of direction, I guess. Which is fine if you are just after the food aspect, but I guess I kind of wanted just some theme running throughout to kind of make the whole thing a bit cohesive, as the stories altogether felt a little random. But after that memoir, I decided that I actually wanted to delve into fiction again for a little bit of escapism after so many mentions about war. So the next book I picked up in December was actually a science fiction book, and that's Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. This novel centers around a middle school teacher who is basically tasked with saving the Earth. He one day wakes up on a spaceship and he slowly remembers that the Earth was facing an extinction level event, as there's a microorganism on the sun that's consuming all of the sun's energy, and he goes to space in order to find a solution. And on his journey, he actually runs into an alien friend who he finds out is also facing the same problem. And I rated this book 4.5 stars, which honestly was such a relief to me because science fiction books can be real hit or misses for me. And it's because I often get bored with this genre because they tend to be a little bit too science heavy. And yes, I know that sounds silly because the word science is literally in the genre, so of course you can expect science in science fiction. But I'm just not a maths or science girly, okay? I literally have to use the calculator on my phone to do the most simplest of sums. But I do enjoy books that are set in space, and there is a very fine line here of books that I actually do enjoy in this genre. However, even though this book was full of science, which at times I did slightly skim, I still found the science very easy and digestible. And I think it's down to the fact that the main character was so likable and enjoyable to read. It wasn't this here are the facts kind of info dumping on the reader, but because the main character is a middle school teacher, he explains science in a very easy way for people like me to understand. The story itself is also just a page turner. Like, there are so many many twists and turns throughout that I just wanted to get on to the next chapter after each chapter to find out what was happening. And also, the story was surprisingly emotional because the underlying message was purely about humans' capacity for cooperation and trust, and how these notions can also transcend to alien life. It was just really heartfelt and lovely. I will admit, though, I did know that Ryan Gosling was going to be cast in the film adaptation before I read the book, and I think because of this, I pictured Ryan Gosling throughout whilst I was reading the book, and I really like Ryan Gosling, so I think that kind of made the character more likable, because there were at times that I did find the humour quite cringe and slapstick, which is probably why I didn't give it 5 stars, but I think I gave it a bit more grace because Ryan Gosling was playing the main character, but oh well, I still liked it. I thought it was a good book. This was also a little bit more of a chunkier book as it was almost 600 pages, so for my next book I actually fancied reading a novella. So the third book I picked up last month was Cold Enough for Snow by Jessica Au. This novella follows a mother and a daughter who are both adults and they visit Japan together. They seem quite distant from each other, so they go on this quick trip in order to reconnect. And honestly, nothing really much happens in this book. They just wander around visiting museums and cafes and parks, and it revolves around anecdotes and observations rather than a plot. And I rated this book 2 stars because honestly, along with no plot, there was also no vibes. I did read this in one sitting, but that's purely for the fact that it was less than 100 pages rather than the fact that it was riveting. Because this is not a page turner, it is a slow and I guess melancholic read. The novel is filled with these very lengthy and dense paragraphs that are filled with this very detailed observation about the characters and their dynamics to each other. And I didn't rate this 0 stars because at times the writing was quite meditative and at times the anecdotes were fairly relaxing to read, but my god, the majority of this was very mundane and so boring. It was literally just anecdote after anecdote of stories of just random people, and I think it was trying to be like profound and deep, but honestly it just came across as tedious and a bit dreary. I kept waiting for like an interesting message to like pop up at the end of these stories, but everything just felt very pointless, and I genuinely think I yawned about 1,000,000 times whilst reading this. I genuinely think reading someone's shopping list would have been more exciting than this novel, which is a shame and also quite surprised me because I usually adore portrayals of mother-daughter dynamics, but this I felt like just lacked depth. The way I describe this book is kind of like when an old relative of yours is telling you a really long, boring story about someone you don't know. Throughout it, you just keep thinking, so what? And the next day you end up forgetting it because it was so nothing. I don't know, maybe the story is somebody else's cup of tea, but it really wasn't mine. For my next book, I decided to swivel back around to non-fiction, and this was actually a bit of a heavier book considering I was reading this over Christmas, and that's Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Ledge. The title is kind of wild, but the story behind it is that this was the title of a blog post that the author wrote years before publishing this book. Obviously, this caused a lot of reaction, some good, some bad, and the author decided to write a book exploring the in-depth topics that she explores within the blog post. She examines systemic racism in Britain through history and politics, as well as the lived experience, and explores issues of colonialism and white privilege and feminism's gaps, to ultimately show how racial and class prejudice is literally built into the bedrock of this country. And I rated this book 3.5 stars, which I need to flag that my rating here doesn't reflect the significance of the topics explored. If it was based on that, then this book would easily be 5 stars because these are some very important topics that need to be discussed more. But let me explain why I gave this 3.5 as my rating. I actually specifically picked this book up because whilst I was on a night out in my hometown over Christmas, I witnessed a white man shout a racial slur to a black man. And that's not the first time that I've witnessed that, but it really does just jar me every time that I see such explicit racism like that. And overall, being a woman of colour in the UK, because I'm part Iraqi and part Ukrainian, it has just been quite horrific to witness the rise of racism that this country has been going through. For example, the rise in the Reform Party and just general public attitudes towards non-white communities. And arguably it is more important than ever to read books like this, and I would actually encourage every single white British person to read this if you haven't already, because it's a very concise way of explaining how certain systems are set up in the UK to be inherently prejudiced towards people of colour, and it's exhausting and infuriating, and it shows how black people above all experience these struggles worse than anyone else. And honestly, that reason alone should be enough to encourage you to read this book. However, my main reason for not giving this 5 stars isn't due to the topics, but is more for the author's research methods. The retired academic girly in me found a lot of problems in terms of how she collected her data in order to draw her conclusions. For me, there wasn't enough statistical evidence and advice based on these findings. Instead, there were a lot of individual anecdotes from singular people, and she would draw quite sweeping generalizations and conclusions on racism from those. An example of such is that she asked one friend of their experience on being mixed race, but she used this to form blanket generalizations on every single mixed race person. And as a mixed race person myself, I didn't actually agree with everything she said because her circumstances were totally different from mine, and I think that this book lacks nuance in that way. The author did make a really good point on her blog post in the fact that it is not people of color's responsibility to educate white people on issues of race, but if the author has decided to write a book to expand on these topics and actually explore what she meant in the blog post, then I do think there needs to be more complex examination on these issues and more strategic guidance going forward, rather than just listing cliches that people of color face. So my overall opinion is that if you are white British, or to be honest even American, I would still recommend this as a starting point in order to understand the lived experience of people of color in the UK. But if you're more clued in on these topics, like for me, reading this book wasn't groundbreaking, I kind of knew pretty much all the material that she was talking about, still feel free to read this. I think it was still a good book, and it really concisely summed up the issues that are going on in the UK, but I would just say take her research findings with a pinch of salt. And after finishing that book, I think I was in the mood for reading more about books that explored race, so the next book I read was Homeland by Barbara Kingsolver. This is a short story, and I mean incredibly short. I think it's literally only 30 to 40 pages long, and it's set in Appalachia, where we follow a Native American family whose lives are very heavily shaped by their local culture and their natural landscape. And we read about their family pride and their love for their culture, while simultaneously feeling alienated in their own homeland. And I rated this book 3 stars, which, to be honest, isn't that surprising for me given that this was a short story. Because honestly, my main gripe with this book is that it just ended too abruptly. I genuinely had to check that the book didn't have missing pages because the ending was so unsatisfying. And this is usually the reason why I don't like short stories, because I always do find that they end too abruptly and I get annoyed with the ending. I don't know why authors do this, where they write the ending where it just feels like we're just cut in the middle of a scene. I find it really frustrating. However, this is my first book by Barbara Kingsolver, and this really showed me what a great writer she is. I have Demon Copperhead that I've been meaning to get around to for literally ages, but after finishing Homeland, this has encouraged me to pick it up sooner. But her writing is just simply gorgeous. It is very beautiful, it is also very whimsical, and I personally adore stories that are based on Native American culture, and it's definitely something I want to read more of going into next year. And I like the messaging of this story in particular, as it revolves around identity and belonging, and how heartbreaking it is for Native American people to see their homeland transform before their eyes into something that they don't recognize anymore. How colonizers have destroyed their genetic and cultural roots and have left nothing behind in the historical annihilation of their own country. Of course, this story does tell these notions in a bit more gentle and whimsical way, but you can still pick up on this quiet sadness that this family feels over the loss of what was. I honestly wish that this book was just fleshed out into a whole novel rather than a novella, because I just feel like it had so much potential. If this was developed into a full plot and the characters were really well developed, I genuinely think that this would have been a 5 stars for me. One of my favourite books from last year was Betty by Tiffany McDaniel, which also explores the same notions, and I would honestly lap up other books like this. I thought that book was phenomenal. But finally, we are on to the last book I read in December, which was also the last book I read in 2025, and that book was Winter in Sokcho by Elisa Shua Dusapin. In this novel, we follow a French-Korean woman who works at a guest house in a beach town during the snowy off-season. And one day, her quiet routine life is disrupted when a French graphic novelist visits the guest house seeking inspiration for his book. And they ultimately form a connection where they explore identity, belonging, and cultural divides. And despite that relatively interesting premise, I only rated this 2.5 stars because it turned out to be not that interesting. I'll start off positive with things I liked. I really enjoyed the setting for this book. I liked this idea of this isolated town that's covered in snow. Everything felt very moody, and all the characters were going through their own individual struggles. The main character in particular was struggling with identity and body dysmorphia, as she was always being criticized by by her mother. And we see how these struggles permeate through all these different aspects of her life, including her relationship with her fiance, her dynamic with this artist, and her future working at this guest house. I also like this exploration of mixed ethnicity, how this woman who is French and Korean, she tries to fit into either of these ethnicities, but she ends up feeling alienated from both. And it was also very atmospheric. It was a great read for winter with the very melancholic cold weather. However, overall, I just felt like this book just didn't have any depth or direction. I think it really lacked the emotional punch it could have had. As mentioned, all these characters do go through all these different struggles, but I somehow felt like the book was empty of emotion. Like when I finished it, I was like, yes, objectively, all these things are sad, but I personally didn't feel anything towards any of the characters. I just felt like I was locked out of their emotions, like the author wrote them at arm's length, so I could never really get close enough to them to understand them, which was also quite frustrating because there was basically zero plot here. And I always think if you're going to have zero plot, you at least need to make your characters interesting and strong enough to, stand up on their own, but I honestly just thought that was lacking. I was also expecting some further discussion about social issues going on, such as Korea's beauty standards. We had a lot of mentions throughout the book of eating disorders and plastic surgery and modelling mentioned throughout, but it kind of just led to nowhere, which is a shame because I felt like this had potential, but it just kind of fell flat. And on that note, those are all the books I read in December. In terms of my personal life last month, December for me is purely a let's go out and drink and catch up with every single member of my family and friends that I know month. And that's exactly what I did. I think I spent more time in pubs and bars than I did in my own house. I don't even have that much footage to show you as I kept forgetting to record stuff, but just know that I had a lot of fun with a lot of people that I love. My Christmas was thankfully more chill when I went back home to Yorkshire, which I think was incredibly needed after finishing off a very busy year. I actually overall really loved 2025 as a year. I met a lot of new fantastic people that have genuinely changed my life, so I can't complain about that. In terms of TV and films I finished Stranger Things season 5, which honestly I'm actually just kind of relieved that show's now finished because I started watching that in 2016 and waiting 10 years for the series to come out has just been a lot. So I'm done with that. I also watched the new Knives Out, which I think is called Wake Up Dead Man, which I absolutely loved. I thought that was fantastic, and actually I have already watched it like 3 times. And I also rewatched Catch Me If You Can and also Cruella, as you do. And there you have it. That was my December summed up in one video. Let me know in the comments what your December was like and also what was your favourite book from the last month. And if you enjoyed this video, why not drop a like down below? And if you're new here, why not subscribe? I make videos about all things books. Feel free to follow me on my Goodreads where I update in real time when I'm reading, and also feel free to follow me on my Instagram. I post my personal things on there, but I also post the books I've read, letting you know what they're about and what I rate them out of 10. Sending lots of love to my returning subscribers who continuously watch and support me, and let's hope by the time I make another video I am well again, because I am sick of being sick. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.